All right, y'all. Peace. Welcome to another episode, another recording of Community Movement Builders Political Education class. And today's class is a personal favorite of mine. This is a really great book, and also a text that is fundamental to a lot of anarchists. African anarchism. Some people feel like that's even an oxymoron, right? That's something I'm gonna get into while we go through this text. But my main focus for this class was to really look at pre-colonial Africa and the kind of government, if you will. They say it's not a government. I completely agree. Or so let me just say communalism or stateless societies that they had, right? And just to understand what different societies look like and how they actually operated, right? Because there's a whole lot of misinformation out there just based off people's assumptions. And then if it's not just people's over glorified assumptions, then it's negative perceptions by the capitalists or people who went in there and raped, pillaged and burned the communities, right? So with that being said, was there any just what's you guys' first thoughts on the text when you read through it?
I'll just say real quick that the text was interesting. It was interesting enough that I actually went ahead and went to Kindle and got the entire text a little bit further. So I did think it was really interesting. But yeah, I'll just say that.
That's dope. That's dope, man. I'm glad you liked it like that. Anybody else? All right. Like I said, this is personally one of my favorites. Go ahead, Sekou.
I like the fact that oftentimes we don't necessarily hear these type of perspectives that are like anti-state or like different from like the usual perspectives that we hear coming from our movement. So I like the fact that it's a historical example of pre-colonial African societies from an anarchist perspective or anti-state or just like a divergent perspective from what we usually hear. I like that he was able to historicalize that.
Right. That's one of my favorite things about it too, is always got to get these historical examples, right? And not just kind of go off like imagination, but really say this is a particular society. This is what it looks like. And so let's jumping into the text. I want to say first, he was saying on page 26 here, he was going through how he said to a greater or lesser extent, all the traditional African societies manifested anarchic elements, which upon close examination lend credence to the historical truism that governments have not always existed. They are but a recent phenomenon and are therefore not inevitable in human history. While some anarchic features of traditional African societies existed largely in past stages of development, some of them persist and remain pronounced to this day. What this means is that the ideals underlying anarchism may not be so new to the African context. What is new is the concept of anarchism as a social movement or ideology. And so first, I wanted to say, like, what is the thoughts around that? Like, I think it's always important to bring those historical examples like we were just talking about, because understanding the ideologies that people bring today, they try to make it seem like where we're at is the most progressive place that we've been, and that it's a linear progression to 2023 capitalist state societies, and everything else is kind of backwards. And if we didn't have the society that we lived in, what societies will there be? How would we even exist? Right. So I think that was an important part to point out, that this type of reality didn't always exist. Any thoughts around that?
I'll say just real quickly that what you read there reminds me of something else he said later, which he called, I believe he called like if you believe in the evolution of how societies generally go from like communalism to feudalism to capitalism. He was talking precisely or primarily about European and Asian cultures. So I think I'm not sure if it's a contradiction per se, but I feel like there's some type of conflict there between what he stated there, as in this type of governments hasn't always been here, but yet he seemed to believe in the linear projection of eventually Africa would have went through the same path as Europe and it's most Europe and Asian societies. I'm not sure if it's like a contradiction, but it just seems like there may be some conflict with saying, well, it seems like he believed in that leader projection, but here he stated that that's not necessarily the case.
Right. I definitely understand what you're saying. And I think in the book, he kind of goes on to talk about, the differences of how one thing led to feudalism and why others don't. So we'll keep that in mind when we go through the text, because that is something I'm going to ask later on. But that's pointing towards the Marxist theory of historical materialism, and that, some societies go from one thing to another, but we see that it doesn't always happen that way.
Right. He stated that most of Africa didn't necessarily come into like a state feudalist type of society. Most of it was stayed communal. And he even said that historians usually break up the society that way, break it up into what these communities became feudalism and these didn't. And then he stated that even when capitalism was imposed, there was still many what he calls anarchic elements that still persisted.
Well, let me jump to that. I want to go ahead and jump to that point, right? Because since we're on it already, which is pretty good. First, I want to say before I go into that, let's look at, mode of production to answer this question that's bringing up. He brought up communalism is a mode of production, right? Communalism is also, he says traditional African societies were for the most part founded on communalism. This term is used here in two senses. First, it denotes a definite mode of production or social formation that comes generally, though not inevitably, after hunter-gatherer societies, and in turn precedes feudalism, if one like what you just said, right? So what is a mode of production? Just a pop quiz. No wrong answers.
I would say a method by which you create something for mass use, or generally a methodology of creation.
Okay. And it's important for us to just say those things like that, because once we start making our own definitions, we have to be able to explain and understand it in our own language rather than, trying to get it straight from a dictionary. You know what I mean? So, say that again.
The way I would say it for myself is a mode of production is a methodology of creation, a means by which you create something. And the mode is like the method, is the way I would think of it.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Let's compare this to what he was saying. The method of producing the necessities of life, whether health, food, housing, or needs such as education, science, so on and so forth, right? Now, this is from Marxist.org. So I would say that that's pretty much in line with that, right? It's a method of producing the necessities of life. And so, communalism, he's saying in this pre-colonial sense, was their mode of production. And we all know what's our mode of production today. Capitalism, right? Capitalism is the means how this society produces the necessities for life, although we know that they don't do a good job in producing those things, right? And I want to go ahead and just introduce everybody to this term, the means of production. Just in case you don't know, means of production is a term which involves land or labor, which can be used to produce things. So we would be considered a kind of means of production in a capitalist society, right? And the land. And so, this is just some quick definitions I looked up while I was going through the book, so we can all get a good understanding. A capitalist mode of production is characterized by private ownership of the means of production, right? The necessities of things like me and you, things of land, things of labor, right? Extraction of surplus value by the owning class for the purpose of capitalist accumulation, wage-based labor, and at least for commodities for concern, a market-based society, right? So they want to exploit labor to create commodities to buy and sell on the market, right? So I just want to get everybody an understanding of what mode of production means. And so he goes on to say that that's what it is in these societies. So when I go back to the text here, jumping on page 28, he says, where is it at? Yeah, the relationship between the coordinating segments of the community was characterized by equivalence and opposition, and this tended to hinder the emergence of role of specialization and thus a division of labor amongst individuals. And I think that this is what you're talking about, Jadorian, right? Because to me, the way that the mode of production was set up, they talked about sharing those tasks. And so there was never a specialized means of production. And so there was never a transition from communalism to another one, or that it's not necessarily guaranteed. You know what I mean? Based on right. How each group comes together and does it. But even though in other parts of the book, he does talk about how those relations did develop for some people, versus others.
Right, absolutely. He also mentioned that's why he also mentioned that the communalism, the way that those societies were set, there wasn't a lot of mass production as we understand it now, which is why he also mentioned that anarchism is anarchism as a mode of thought, as a movement, came later from a particular point in history, because the conditions that existed was different in the traditional times. So he separates, I guess, anarchist thought from what he calls anarchic elements also.
Right, in a sense, yeah, in a sense that like the ideological kind of framing of it, and the way that I interpret it was that in the book, he's saying that these folks were living it in the pre-colonial sense, right? They were kind of living it, but its ideological manifestation happened in Europe, but
right. Because they had the specialization, it wasn't there yet. So like I think he meant like the level of production wasn't there yet, because the specialization wasn't there yet. That's something that came later, which eventually produced that type of framing of anarchism.
Right. Okay. So I was going to ask that question. I mean, that to me is why, when we talk about differences in setups and like why some societies moved in a way versus others, we could look at how these mode of productions are set up and how they're meeting the needs of the people, right? So in this way, like we were just saying, this particular segment of the community hinder the emergence of role specialization. And I almost wanted to think about how we could set up our own organizations if we wanted to prevent such role specializations in and of ourselves too, right? Because, to me, it's about trying to live out these different worlds, if this is what we're trying to return back to necessarily. But, okay. So getting back to the book. So he called it a mode of production in one sense. In a second sense, he says it denotes a particular way of life that's African, distinctly African. And I thought that was unique, right? That he said that this form of communalism, as different from others, this is a distinct African way of life, right? So he said different communities enjoyed near unfettered independence from one another. Communities manage their own affairs and for all practical purposes, self-accounting and self-governing, and every individual without exception takes part either directly or indirectly in the running of community affairs on all levels, right? I wanted to ask, because you see, he goes through the book and in terms of self-accounting and self-governing, he talks about how the society is set up in such a way where it's horizontal and you have these specialized secret societies that exist. And they're all almost like a checks and balances of each other. And there's no centralized form of hierarchy or authority. And I wanted to ask, why do you think that that type of relationship is needed for communalism to exist?
Well, definitely in the structure of communalism, I know like in Hoodoo, for instance, shamanism, that's not something that everybody can participate in. So as, you know, myself as a healer, I've had friends call me a shaman and and I'll tell them I'm not at that level, quote unquote, but I am practicing medicine and I have helped people heal themselves both, holistically using plant medicine and just by, just tapping into universal law. But not everyone can tap into that. And there would have to be a checks and balances, right, to denote, like if I did decide to call myself a shaman and be like, yeah, I'm a plant medicine, and then someone comes to me for that healing and I can't provide that, I could, it could damage their health, could kill them. And so it's really important that, you're tapping into your gift or your line of work or whatever it is that you're doing, and even in say for building, you could have somebody says, I know how to do electricity. That's why you have to go like 7 years of being a foreman in that sort of colonial construct. But there are skills and trades that we learn, and those things were always passed down, whether it's hunting, whether it's gathering, whether it's, fermenting food and herbs or whatnot. All of those things are passed down. And in Hoodoo, we say everything is remembered, nothing is learned. So for us, traditionally in community was when you have that sort of, it's not a hierarchy, but it's more of an eldership, because anybody can be old and not have knowledge. But the elders who did have the knowledge was passing that down to the people who were inside that community learning those things. So that's why it's important to keep that structure, because in colonialism, they say this person is in charge because they have a degree that we gave. And so, we all know how that works.
Right on. Yeah. There's a lot of things we can break down into that too. One, they talked about elders like that. I had a conversation with Professor Griff one time, and he told me, everybody's not an elder. Some of those are elders, right? Because, it's not that you just get to a position. You don't just grow old, right? And then all of a sudden you're like, we were supposed to refer to you as an elder. It's almost like a position in the society, right? And you meet a certain function, right? So even here, he says, elders presided at meetings and at the settlement of disputes, but hardly in the sense of superiors. Their position did not confer the far-reaching social political authority associated with the modern state system or with feudal states, right? And there's other areas that he talked in the book how those positions weren't divinely inspired either. I'm gonna get into that, but so that's also important too, to know that the elders didn't have any more privileges. Like he also said in other parts of the book that they were also doing sharing in with the work and didn't take more of the surplus, right? But they did have a special function that they're in. I think you also said something else about leadership too. And, in the book, he talked about how leadership focused on the interests of the group rather than the authority over its members. Invariably, the elders shared work with the rest of the community and received more or less the same share of value of the total social produce as everyone else, often through tribute or redistributive mechanisms. So I think that that's something that we should look at, is redefining leadership and what that is and how it serves our interests, right? Because what I see with some of the groups is sometimes not, of course, everybody knows I'm an anarchist, right? So this is the type of stuff that feeds me, right? Because I'm looking at centralized formations and I'm like, okay, here it is. You get a specialized role sometimes, I see, and people kind of take control, and then they become sole ownership, and everybody goes to them as the one, you know. And I always look at how to disperse those relationships, because it always seems to fall towards some hierarchy and centralization, and those things get reproduced through the institutions in our society, because that's what we look towards. But does anybody have any thoughts on that? Just on leadership and on elderhood that we just talked about.
I just personally feel like leaders.
We can't hear you. We can't hear you.
No, can you hear me now?
It's real low.
Really low.
What about there?
It's still kind of low.
I don't know why it's so low. My mic just messed up. But
there you go.
Okay, so I was saying that dang, I lost my phone. Being a leader, you know, it's basically whoever goes first, you know, sometimes, because a lot of people think that people can be designated leaders, but just a small part, I think, you know, it definitely has to be leadership in a leaderful manner, right? You know, not just the blind leading the blind. I can go more into that if I need to, but I just want to just drop that little drop, because sometimes people have the know-how and how to lead people and how to take people in the right direction, but they sometimes can just need a little push to be told, hey, this is what you need to do. But I like that part where a lot of times we get lost in the sauce of designating sort of people to be in charge of things, and then they do run with it. But I definitely think that in building nation, it does, or you know, nation building or community building, it does definitely has to be where responsibilities are designated to maybe one person, but then that person can always be not demoted, but that responsibility can be given to someone else. I always think like being in a restaurant, like a restaurant manager kind of knows how to cook. The little front of the house manager will know how to run the host station, as well as greet people and seat people, knows how to run all aspects of the front of the house. May not be doing that, but they can do those things. The same with back of the house management. Like they know how to cook, they know how to wash dishes, they know how to make desserts. And so that, but they can easily pass that on to like a manager that's below them. But again, that's the colonial aspect of things and how we taught. Sorry, I lose my train of thought here. But
yeah, I mean, yeah. Oh, somebody else gonna go?
Yeah, I just add real quick, because you know how I am with when it comes to leadership, and then I can start. I kind of, I definitely understand what I liked about what he spoke about as far as the communal society is that everyone participated, regardless of age group. Everyone had a role to play in making sure that the society functioned well. And I think that's something that maybe organizations can learn from today, is to make sure that everyone who's a known member of the organization is playing some type of meaningful part as far as the running of the organization. And also, I think what it also reads to me, and maybe this is a incorrect way to read it, but it does read to me as it requires a lot of work. If you don't have a dominating top-down structure, then you need a deeply horizontal, diffuse type of function, a way of doing things, because there's not a dominating over the top structure handling most of the work for you. So it requires the community to do a lot of work. And it reads to me like it just requires a lot of work for the community to do. So that will require things like, education and so forth.
That's a powerful point, man. Things will require lots of education, right? Like which to me is the best, one of the best forms of emancipation, right? Is being able to educate the individual. But the thing is like what you're saying, it takes a lot of hard work. But that's what they were saying, is that within these societies, everybody, right, was expected to put in their effort, put in their work. Everybody was expected to do these things. No one was able to slack off. Even the age ranges that were produced, that was to form tighter bonds. But even some of the younger ages were still expected to join in and look for, like what they said, lost cattle or anything like that. And I always think of agriculture. So to me, in my mind, I'm thinking, there's a shared responsibility, and, Maurice, you may have to help me on there, and just whatever people on the earth do when they farm, So, but it's a shared thing, because there's also, no one owns the land. So everybody's coming together anyway to work together. So, but I do think that there is an assumption that, everybody has to put in a certain amount of work, because it's, there is how everybody eats, right? Everybody kind of has to eat together. So it's like, each individual puts in to maximize the benefit of it all. Is how I kind of interpret that. And speaking of that, I wanted to, and before we leave off division of labor, we can read kind of what Marx said about this, right? And why he felt the division of labor was bad. So, and mind you, this is Wikipedia. So if you guys want to check other things, there can be, but this is something I thought was just, clear, good overview. So just to go through, division of labor is a separation of task in any economic system or organization, so that participants may specialize, may form a specialization, right? So if you go down to Marx here, he says, Marx argued that increasing the specialization may also lead to workers with poor overall skills and lack of enthusiasm for their work. He described the process of alienation. Workers become more and more specialized and work becomes repetitive, eventually leading to complete alienation from the process of production. The worker then becomes depressed spiritually and physically to the condition of the machine. Additionally, Marx argued division labor creates less skilled workers. As the work becomes more specialized, less training is needed for a specific job, and the workforce overall is less skilled than if one worker did the job entirely, right? And, he goes on to say things like, it puts, people against each other in this capitalist market, because if we're all having to compete to get jobs, then, we're competing for these small spaces against each other and getting exploited. And then the capitalists will drive up the production and replace certain labor, human labor, with machine labor, right? And we'll find no need for human labor anymore. So I was just happy to read that, because that's, my early Marx stuff that I like so much. Any thoughts on that? Just on division of labor and how that's considered a feature of a capitalist mode of production. The division of labor, therefore wage slavery. You see, and so, with communalism, and Marx also said, that vision of labor has to be overcome to have a more communalistic society. All right. So one of the favorite things I read was right here on this page. And he said, when people got together and, elders presided over administrations of justice, the settlements of disputes, and the organization of communal activities, functions they necessarily share with selective representatives of the communities, depending on the specific nature of the disputes involved, right? He goes on to say, such meetings and gatherings were not guided by any known written laws, for there were none. Instead, they were based on traditional belief systems, mutual respect, and indigenous principles of natural law and justice. Social sanctions existed for various kinds of transgressions: theft, witchcraft, adultery, homicide, rape. When an individual committed an offense, often his entire household, his kinsmen, and his extended family suffered with him, and sometimes for him. This was because such offenses were believed to bring shame not only upon the individual, but even more so upon his relatives. So one reason why I really like that part was particularly because there's a lot of notion that pre-colonial Africa is this utopia, that nothing bad ever happened, right? And so like sometimes I hear people say, well, there is no word for jail, which is true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that no crime happened or that people weren't, doing their own things, and committing offenses. But what they had was they were strict laws governing their society, and then they had ways of dealing with it. And so I just wanted to get you guys' thoughts around those things of having a communal society that didn't have these laws, right, that are needed that kind of lock people up, but they did have such things together to where it didn't create centralized authority.
Yeah, I just say real quick that this is interesting to me because I'm also reading Mboji, I believe is how you pronounce it, and he talks about the political system of Mboji there, which had secret societies as well, people who were masked and who were pretty much unidentified so that they can give out justice without anyone feeling like, oh, this is just a favor for a particular kin, a particular family, or anything like that. So they hid their identities behind masks. And it was a part of these secret societies as well. And I also like this because it's a stark contrast to individualism. Now, of course, I think it may be a little bit extreme to say, hey, if I go out there at the food, people in my household got to pay. But what's going on now? People think, that they do whatever they want because, the world revolves around them. But if you knew that your actions can also affect people in your household, not just on a social level or of like, are you dressing crazy? And, so people, what they're going to make people think about your mama. But like, there can actually be consequences, I think that would be interesting. I wonder how people will respond to that type of communal collective punishment.
Yeah, and that's powerful, man. You see how everything is being reinforced on the social level, and I know that at one point in time there were things like that even in America, but as things become more individualized and it's like, well, that's what they do, it does become harder to then try to reverse back and try to say, let's be a team again, when our whole lives have been dependent on individual achievement, individual recognition, individual responsibility for an individual crime, so then it's almost like there is an allowed detachment from one another because that's what you do, and so instead of thinking about how it affects the community. But that I would like to hear anybody else about that as far as like how would they feel about a collective punishment. Oh, go ahead, Jadorian.
Oh no, I'll let somebody else speak. I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
You good? Everybody thinks you're the smartest person here. Go ahead.
Oh, let me go. Collective punishment. I think I would be interested in possibly a measured where maybe it doesn't go beyond fines. So maybe there could be some type of money attached to actions out there that people in your immediate family or household are involved in. But beyond fines, I'm not sure because it gets a little bit more tricky after that. But maybe it'd be fine. It was just like you get fined because your little brother went down and knocked somebody's trash can over for the second time. So now you got to get a fine.
But you know what? These are good conversations to have because we may not be so severe, as we develop our own codes, but then just to have the philosophy there is really important. Is that Sekou? You got a question?
Yes, sir. Just to add on to what's been said, turning like a collective justice. Everybody know I'm from Atlanta, so once upon a time in Atlanta, there was over 40 housing projects. And this talking from like, people during that time period and like my family. And this seems to be kind of a consensus universally almost in that era where, at least in the project, your neighbor can whoop your child. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily should be a thing now, but that what makes me think like a collective justice or accountability, that people felt so much of like a say or a sense of like belonging to other people, like they felt a responsibility to correct, say like a misbehavior from like children, or to the fact that like your teacher told your mother to the neighbor. It was like a cycle of different people who can hold you account in your community, in your direct, immediate environment. That's how it was, at least from what I was told from my parents and people from that era, that in the Black community in Atlanta, there was at least some level of like accountability to other people on the street level to varying degrees, that you couldn't just do what you wanted to do. It was consequences, even with the street guys.
Yeah.
And just to add on, I'm not sure if there's someone who knows more about it, but if so, definitely speak to it. Is this sort of similar to the idea of social credit that's going on in China? I don't know if they actually activated the program, but I've heard that they got some type of social credit program that's based on behavior.
I don't know about that. I have heard about it. Let's check that out later. We'll put that in that chat and we'll bring this up next time. And just to come back to cover the bases, unless anybody does know. I'm just saying that because I've heard about it, but I never studied it. I am going to say this as somebody who embraces forms of individual anarchism, right? I would have a huge problem at times with, and I'm glad you kind of said that, because there's times where I've had huge problems with collective justice, right? So I was in the Army and we got collective punished all the time, for one person stuff, right? And so I know there's going to be parts of me that always forms a rebellion against anything that would be over, my autonomy, but I do understand the philosophy behind it. But okay, so that was a good conversation, but let's get to where I want to jump to next. We're going to get into what they talked about as far as they talked about how communities were not completely independent from each other, right? Like what he said, near fettered, right? But they weren't completely separated to the point where they just never spoke to each other again and they were all in their own silos, right? There were parts where they talked about exchange, and that exchange led to them coming into communications and whatever they were to trade is because one group didn't have. And I think that may be a big misconception about communalism in general and like localism, is that people kind of think that those things mean that we're never going to have a communications with other people. And so I think that that's a misconception on both sides, right? On people who want to be communalists, they're like, oh, we don't have to deal with other people. It needs to just be all us and completely self-reliant. But there's always an interdependency of different groups. So is there any comments on that? All right. Moving on. I wanted to also talk about how they said that there was no permanent military here, right? They said here, speaking of collective punishments and stuff like that, and what you were talking about earlier, Dorian, about the wearing a mask to carry out punishments to stay clear of favoritism. They also talked about how both the age grades and the secret societies perform quasi-military and police functions in the absence of a formal military institution, army, or police force, right? Every adult member of the community took an active part in the discharge of these functions for the good of the community as a collectivity. Thus, for example, every adult male member of the community would be expected to participate in the search for a reported stolen or a missing oxen, sheep, goat, or cow. So what are you guys' thoughts on that? I mean, could that be, first of all, what are you guys' thoughts on having a non-formal military institution? Because part of the anarchist theory of the state is that they have a monopoly on violence, and that's what help goes into the formation of a state, and that monopoly has a professional, institutionalized look to it, such as the military or the police force. So what you have in these communal societies are non-permanent forces, people coming together to do certain functions of these institutions, right? But I see sometimes, like I wonder if our movements need to adopt that, or how does that even look like in terms of when we say we want to police our own communities, or we feel like each group has to have their own military and things like that. Is that in some ways a contradiction, and just what are your thoughts in general on, how they set up their militaries and police forces?
Yeah, I think it's fine within a communal context. But when you have state formations, I think that's when it becomes an issue. Because I don't see how you could defend yourself against those state institutions. I think it makes more sense for organizations within state institutions who need to have a military type of I guess, underground political force. I think it makes perfect sense in that case. If you have an institution and you need an underground force, I think this makes sense. But as just a community that's autonomous, I don't know if it would do you much good if you have to go against a state formation with a professional structured military in that sense.
Any thoughts? Because I definitely understand that aspect of what you're saying. And the reason why I understand this communal structure is because when you talk about the anonymity that's needed to carry out justice, if you have this professionalized force, you kind of have this oppression that could swing both ways, or a force of violence that could swing both ways, both for and against the people. And so I think to disband those things is a constant letting that kind of pent up energy go when it's not needed. And I think it's harder to kind of control a population that could kind of, in my opinion, that could kind of disperse when needed, or not, like, if you can kind of destroy that military, you kind of taken over, I think in so many ways. But I do understand your point, like, to a certain context, because we look at what happened, we look at history, and we look at how people get conquered, right? And people get murdered and killed. But it's almost like, how do we prevent ourselves from becoming that? Is kind of how I look at it. You know what I mean? While it's like a force may be needed to fight against, we don't want to become this thing either.
Right, that's why I would ask you, do you think it's possible to avoid that while trying to defeat white supremacy, capitalism? Is it possible to avoid having something similar to professional militaries?
I think so. I think it's definite. Yeah. Oh, I think it's definitely. All right. Well, hold on. Let me make sure I'm answering the question. Are you saying, do I think it's possible to not engage in any military conflict?
Not in any military conflict, just for instance, the alliance between Russia and China. Do you think that alliance could be what it is without them having their own standing militaries against the dominant, against white domination, against the dominant capitalist mode? Would they be able to, I guess, resist that without having their own standing militaries?
Yeah, because to me, I think the real resistance to me is of course the change of mode of production and the change of human behavior, right? Because it's really that white supremacy and capitalism kind of destroys itself. It's when it tries to have that empires always come and go and they always collapse, and they can never withstand themselves. And a lot of times, those civilizations fall not as a result of huge military battles, at least from a revolutionary force. They kind of fall from their own internal contradictions and trying to extend too much. So I do think the networking between various communal societies and making sure that our mode of production is different is more the way I go with. But there are forms for militias that do need to be formed for such instant battles. I guess I could say, like, I always look at the Taliban. I always look at places like Afghanistan that had a constant struggle, but they never had a formal military, I don't think, at least how I see it and defined it, So it could be, dependent on their situation and their territories, right? I think that kind of militias is what works better, I think, even in Palestine, and even kind of resistance against those things in general. But that's just my personal opinion. Anybody else? So, okay, with that being said, but I feel like I'm my pro-blackness is coming in my head, like, but you can't reform the Yorugu. You can't, that white man is just the devil. That Baruti, that stuff is in the back of my mind, like, but they got to go, So go ahead. I hear somebody else is gonna say something. I thought I heard somebody. Okay, so again, I wanted to go back to the division of labor thing. He says several socio-political changes in the communal economy accompanied the productive increases. The emergence of skilled iron workers created increasing specialization and division of labor, while increases in production open up opportunities for trade, profiteering, and accumulation of disproportionate wealth in the hands of a few. With expanded trading activities, barter began to give away to the use of metallic objects as standards of valuing other goods, right? So now we're talking about, like, how some of these transitions are happening. Again, they're coming at the emergence of divisions of labor. He talks about how some of the women were treated in the societies, right? Despite the marked equality and egalitarian generally associated with African communalism, there existed a degree of privilege and internal differentiation in some communities, made worse sometimes by the traditional caste system, right? So, the vision of labor leading up to some people holding that power, in addition to high degree of egalitarian freedom achieved under communalism, was made possible in no small measure by low levels of production. So communalism was not an anarchist utopia. Nowhere is that more evident than in the generally low status of women and some forms of communalism. This was made worse, at least on the surface, by the practice of polygyny. One man married to several women, often sisters. In many African communities, however, tradition and custom accorded certain protections to females, most injuries to them, with important exceptions of, I think this is female genital mutilation that they're talking about, and some societies were severely punished. And there were some matrifocal communal societies famous for their traditional women leaders. So I guess there he's saying that there's differences in the communal societies, but there wasn't a perfect pre-colonial utopia that we could all point at and be like, oh, that's just what it is, There, some of these things emerged in there where some people have power, women were subjected on one side versus another. So we have to keep in mind, don't let that division of labor with the women and men create that much of a separation too, to where they're going to be oppressed, right? Yeah. So I want to jump to these last parts of the book, given that we're running out of time. Page 35. Oh, stateless societies in Africa. Did anybody read anything that stood out to them about the different societies that he talked about? The Igbo, the Niger Deltas, the Telensi. Anything that stood out? I know for me, the Igbo stood out. They said, the Igbo is where we have no kings. And it was and their communities were separated into wards, and they all had their own administrative functions. Did any of that stand out to anybody?
No, that was interesting. What stood out to me the most was when he started talking about the different I guess socialist attempts. He talked about this one called Ujuma, I believe. That's how you pronounced it. That was really interesting to me when he started talking about Ujuma. I think I forget which one it was, Tanzania or I forget where it was at, but it was some type of Ujuma principle. That was really interesting.
Okay. And I definitely like how, when they talked about communalism in these different states, how they would have these assemblies, where everybody would kind of come in and discuss the problems, and that a general consensus and not a vote was reached. And, the difference between the consensus and the vote is that votes can sometimes be individual, right? Or they are individual, even though we view it as a collective vote. 10 people or 9 out of 10 people, and 9 people could vote for, to jump off a building, and one says no, so that's like individual kind of voting. But consensus is everybody speak up and express your opinions as much as possible, so we can try to get to a unanimous decision about something. I want to say Marxism kind of goes into that with democratic centralism. But I wanted to know, what are you guys' feelings about those differences in consensus versus like voting?
Yeah, I think that would be interesting if we're dealing with, if it deals with like important decisions organizationally. I think I would like to try that within an organization, to see important decisions of the organization get made on a consensus basis. Not every decision, of course, because I think that would be impractical, a little too much if it's every decision, but some general important decisions, I think it would be interesting to see how that actually works. And I think it could work with everyone within the organization, because some people can be virtual or someone can be there with technology now. I think everybody in the organization can actually participate in consensus decision making.
Yeah, I think one of the key things here that he talked about with these stateless societies, that they were, homogenous in character, right? So there wasn't huge differences between each members of the group, right? And I feel like, when we form groups and we're trying to reach a consensus on things, a lot of times it doesn't work if we all have like vastly different understandings and drastically different parts of ourselves that we're trying to form together, And so like, I think that this is part of the issue, is that, like they were saying about the Igbo, they said they may come from different hoods, but when they leave, they all still Igbo, right? And there's a way of doing things that they kind of understand that I think direct democracy works better towards, versus like, you know, if you're trying to pull together so many differences of people, I think that's what leads into some of the issues.
So when you say differences, you mean like ideologically, too much ideological difference?
I think ideological, I think even like cultural sometimes, you know what I mean? Just like sometimes different personalities, and like you know, like if you get a small revolutionary group and everybody is from that town, let's say if it's in, you know, some part of Georgia, Lithonia, Georgia, and everybody kind of grew up there and had that same kind of ideological mentality and kind of grew up in the same neighborhoods and stuff like that, direct democracy would probably work. Okay, peace out, Maurice. But I think when we get people spread out, especially if you got different ideologies, it makes the direct democracy harder. So yeah, I am saying in one sense political, and that's the major part, but I also think even other things, you know, cultural differences and how people grew up, because it's like, you know, you got to kind of get to know folks in your groups too, especially if we're talking about making transitions to different societies. All right. All right, let me cover this one more thing here. So he talks about the incorporation of pre-colonial society to the capitalist mode of production worldwide, right? And he talked about how that was accompanied by that's somebody's phone. You might have to press mute. That was accompanied by military conquest, right? And a change of their mode of production. And so basically what you see is in addition to military actions, no, I'm sorry, there were two stages, here it is. And the process of incorporation, which is the state served as a vehicle for capitalist penetration and ultimate engulfment of production and distribution in the colonies. The first stage was violent conquest. They're talking about people coming into Africa. And the next was economic domination and enslavement of the native peoples. Forced labor was prominent amongst mechanisms adopted by the colonial powers to eliminate traditional economic systems, right? And we see that that's the kind of disruption to the internal development that Walter Rodney talked about in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, right? And I think Kwame Ture may even talk about this from time to time, because they do go off the Marxist model that goes from the different stages that societies go to reach capitalism and eventually communism. And so they're kind of saying that, you know, Africa didn't develop on its own towards these different things, but there was a disruption within its own internal development. And that disruption was the colonialism, which then forced its economy onto the indigenous populations. And so,
right. And I think he also points out, or he also specifies that it didn't do it completely. Like there were, I forget how he explained it, but he stated that the capitalism wasn't done perfectly, that there wasn't connections between all the different capital industries. Like I forget how he described it in a certain way. I'm trying to remember, but he basically stated that the way it was done wasn't complete. It wasn't done correctly. So Africa was never fully properly brought into the capitalist mode of production. He explained that a little further as well.
Right. Yeah. The critical point here is that the destruction of the traditional economic system did not give rise to a fully capitalist economy, and the end product, rather a distorted, unbalanced capitalist structure. This occurred because Africa's incorporation into the global system was peripheral, complementary, and reciprocity between the various sectors of the economy were absent. Misarticulation was further characterized by a lack of vital linkage within the production process. That is, capitalist development in Africa was characterized by lack of integration. Under colonialism, business operated to serve external markets and usually had little connection with each other. And businesses that would have served internal needs were often systematically discouraged in order to ensure markets for goods produced in the imperial countries. Africa is still suffering the effects of that distorted development pattern. So yeah, it's just like what they're saying, you know, when they came into Africa, they destroyed whatever mode of production they had, communalism or whatever, they destroyed it. And then they gave them the mode of production of these state economies. And then they made them export their main commodities, which in Ghana, which would be like chocolate, and which was completely for the British economy. So it was nothing to benefit those in Africa. And everything that they produced, all that surplus was to go over to Europe, you know, and particularly in Ghana, I think it was with the British, with the UK, I believe, if that's correct. So that's what they're talking about. And that ended up having this uneven development across, because also we know that scramble of Africa, parts on the west and parts in the east, they were all separated into different empires, and some empires came and some, you know, some fell, some are still here. So, you know, what you see is these effects today in Africa through a lack of that integration. But the positive thing is that lack of global integration to me means there's an ability for us to pull out and pull away from capitalism. But we would have to form these alternative economies that serve our own needs rather than the capitalist needs, right? So any thoughts on that?
Right. He also mentioned that the different, I guess what you could call classes or upper classes, were also separated because they particularly just served the interests of the foreign capital as well. He went into that. But this also made me think of my African-centric comrades who would state, well, yeah, they came and they did destroy the mode of production, but it wasn't just a mode of production. They tried to destroy and dominate a people's, a culture, a way of life, a perspective. And that also has something to do with it. And I just wanted to introduce that because, you know, sometimes the mode of production gets all the attention as if there aren't other essential elements of a people's. So, you know, my African Center side is like, yeah, but they destroyed a people groups as well.
And this is what he's talking about right here. The local business class effectively became a compadre class of agents, middleman, and frontman for foreign interests. As Frantz Fanon put it, the national bourgeoisie of undeveloped society is not engaged in production or any creative enterprise, but in intermediary activities. The roles of the local and foreign business classes in post-colonial Africa are complementary, but the later determined activities are the former. And I think he did talk about what you said here, that he briefly mentioned it because socialists are more concerned about the mode of production. And but he did briefly, I think, mention how the state, it was like state and then therefore education and church. I think he may have said something about that. You know, as reinforcing that way of life onto the society. Any other thoughts? Well, I could look for that real quick.
I just want to say that I feel like that was a real good point about how in addition to the, you know, like the particular mode of production is like the purpose of conquest is like the domination and the assimilation of an oppressed people. So I just want to highlight I feel like that was a good point to bring up.
Here it is. As noted earlier, a capitalist economy requires the establishment of social and political institutions that reproduce and regulate class relations. The colonial education system served such a purpose. Together with the church, another agent of socialization, it provided ideological justification for the emergent capitalist mode of production in Africa. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad he put that in there.
Well, you know, that's just, those are some of the some of the things that I think are, what do you call it? They are disagreements, points of disagreements between Afrocentrists and socialists that maybe don't have to be there. But they are there because I think that the focus is different, right? Yeah, because I get the same way, right? Like, because I'm big on culture, and that's very important. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is because this is why the socialists view the economy as or the mode of productions, because they view culture up top here as being kind of it's a superstructure based on the mode of production, or the mode of production really is the one that pursues or influences the superstructure, the art, family, culture, religion, philosophy. So it just all serves to reinforce this. And so they're more concerned about taking over this part here through the state and Marxism. I don't agree with it in totality, but I do agree that economy is the base. Yeah.
Dialectical materialism.
Well, some of my more anarchist readings allowed me to step away from it a little bit, but I think I'm closer. I still have a lot of appreciation for Marxian economy, but yeah. I hope we learned about communalism here. I think we covered. This was a good chapter to just go through that societies like that and getting a peek into anarchist thought, even though I use a lot of Marxism to kind of prove their thought, but yeah.
Just a question I have, and just for like anyone, how would something like that look, not necessarily to import necessarily the experiments of Africa here, but for like the Africans in the United States in our context, how do you feel like kind of like a breakaway will happen? Like, what would something like that look like in our context, in our predicament we find ourselves in now?
I think it would be difficult. I would say it starts first with institution building. I think institutions have to be built and maintained. I think propaganda is important. It's very important. We got to find a way to penetrate the propaganda of the state with our perspectives and our values that are more centered in ourselves. I think also what a lot of institutions do get right is organizing to deal with the material conditions of our people. I think a lot of institutions do get that right. CMB is one of them. And I think I think we just got to build everywhere. I think if we had as many institutions, if we had certain churches, then we may have more of a effect. But what you think, Zaire?
Yeah, in the Maguzi philosophy that I'm writing, I took that on to say, like, how would our institutions look? How would we do it? And I do think it's centered around what I call ethno-political identity, and ethno being the culture that is sustained through those major institutions here: family, economy, politics, education, and religion. And that we should focus, like he said, on creating our own answers to this in our own ways. But going back to the Marxism, I think localism, forming alternative localist economies are most important to this struggle, as we have to have some autonomy to break away from the major capitalist enterprises. So, or the capitalist motor. Go ahead.
So what about, because that makes me think about like political strategy. So what do you think the strategy should be? Should it be more like going out there, protesting, antagonizing the state, or more focused on building and maintaining institutions, organizing to deal with the material needs? Or would you say a mix of both? Or because I know you're not really big on the voting thing, but some people do have what they would call like radical or revolutionary perspectives on dealing with voting. What do you think what would you say is the best political strategy to take?
For the Maguzi, it's a little bit of both of antagonizing the state and building our institutions, but it's more like maybe 70-30 or 80-20 of building institutions. But that's because within building the local economy, you are agitating against the state. So for example, there's some communities, if you look up things like called size caps, so they'll go into like the neighborhood assemblies and they'll say, we want a size cap. And what size caps are is that you cannot, there's a size cap of how much growth you can try to bring, right? So you can't bring too much of this Walmart or Amazon or these corporations to kind of come in, because we want to keep it local and we want to keep our things to where these local businesses thrive. Because when you bring those big corporations in here, they're going to completely destroy everything and we'll lose our autonomy. So that would be a way that we are interacting with the state, right? But we're not just interacting in a sense of, you know, what I look at is all reforms, you know, like, oh, stop, you know, hands up, don't shoot, everything from that, or to like protesting anything and everything, to me is just kind of senseless. But if we did protest around building these institutions so we can have more autonomy for ourselves, that's more of the answer, right? So the protests have to all be centered around building those institutions that will make our lives more autonomous and self-determined in that way. And of course, my main focus is, of course, the economy, because I still think it's the base. But yeah.
That's what's up.
But identity is extremely important. And it may be more important than the economy, though. You know, because if you don't identify with, that's why I say ethno-political, like the Maguzis and identity, or New African. I really like that, because if you don't have an identity with it, then if you're still identified with America, then there's no need to break away, right? There's no need to separate, you know. So I mean, that's why it has to be this both kind of thing. We have to have these institutions, because you gotta transform the individual into what we want them to be, you know. Because otherwise we could form a local economy and it is, so what, you know. we're not independent. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, like, Black Wall Street, like, it's kind of like the more like neoliberal Black attempts, right, as a type of separatism of some sort.
Exactly. It'll be kind of mixed. It'll be the wrong ideal. Exactly. And that's why, you know, my campaign I just started, since y'all got me on it, is buy local, right? Buy Black, you know, because buying Black, could you just supporting Black capitalists, but having the local in there means like local ownership. And there's that goes back, and the surplus stays within the community, which to me is a form of collectivism, you know. You know, and there's size caps here, right? There's definitions on what local ownership means, and not, you know, Walmart has a place where you're at, therefore it's local, right? That's not what that means. But
and then just in addition to what's been said about like the absolute necessity to have our own everything, or at least to the greater degree possible, to have autonomous spaces and institutions, which we can educate a new generation of people who hasn't been indoctrinated to be American citizens. And it just, I feel like the necessary to, like, in terms of like the agitation part, the necessity for like the insurrectionary nature of like whatever like institution that's being developed, like you say, is a, you know, building itself is a form of agitation, but like the act itself being like liberating for like people's mind to see like that, like the state isn't invincible, or like there is a different possibility. Because I feel like conceptually people can accept that, like, all right, we're not Americans, we can be something else. But until like, let's say like in 2020, when the George Floyd uprising, one can like put that into practice and say, this is something else entirely different, because people took physical control of like the space, particularly people was in Atlanta during the Wendy's occupation. And I was in a few cities during that time, but that's probably one of the most powerful things I ever experienced or seen in my life. And like during like political praxis in the United States, it wasn't like an organized left particularly. It was like complete people who, you know, working class people from the neighborhood coming together. And it was becoming politicized through the act of like, you know, insurrection. But this is why like the secondary part becomes a question like, well, what's next? That's why I feel like you guys about necessity, about building an institution comes into play. So I feel like that dialectic of the two is necessary, the tension between the two, because that's the question that always comes at next. With something being burnt down, the next follow question, like, well, what do we do now?
Yeah, I'm all for the burning the windows down. I'm all for the disruption.
Right.
I'm all for it.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important question, because I think that, just to be completely honest, I think that that's our biggest failure across the board. Black, African nationalist, African centered, all the way to don't even call me Black, I'm just happen to be Black and I'm a socialist, is really just what are we trying to accomplish? What are we trying to build? What does come next? And having a real solid answer to that, and not just, well, we just want to seize the means of production. What does that look like? What do you mean? What is that? You know what I mean? And really building towards those things could, to me, also can provide incentives for people to, if they want to join the movements. You may not even have to join a particular one. If we know we need, let's just say, youth centers, then you may, upon yourself, go and build the youth center. And you have the ideology. You may not need to be a part of a greater organization. If we can start identifying the real institutions that we need, right? Because those institutions that I showed, those 5 major social institutions, that's just from sociology, right? That's just saying those are institutions that make up a society, period. So if we're going to have our own, we have to think about how do we address those needs, or how do we build our own alternative to those that built up to our ideology while we're engaging. It doesn't even have to be either or. Like you said, it's a dialectic, but I just don't think we put enough time into really developing those things right here, But I do think we do have to answer that question, though, of I am more of the Marxian type in the economy versus the superstructure, although I think institutions are very important.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure where I stand as of yet. I do think I'm more of the centered perspective, only because I feel like there should be an obligation to be African, understanding that we have our own history, culture, and perspective, our own way of life, which has been attacked and continues to be attacked. I feel like we should have some type of obligation to want to bring sovereignty to Africanity. But at the same time, I feel also a need to answer the type of questions you're speaking about. And I do, at least for what I've read of anarchists, I feel like more than anyone, I think anarchists actually do try to study African history and culture and actually grapple with that more than other isms. So I do appreciate it for that. But I feel you. I think institution building. I think CMB is on the right track when it comes to the idea of autonomous zones, because I do think communities is what the center of nation is, community. So I do think we need autonomous communities. Then the question just is, what type of communities, what type of institutions and organizations within a community are we building? So I think CMB is on the right track as far as focusing on building autonomous communities. Then I think it goes from there.
Question follow-up for you, Brother Jador. You said bringing sovereignty to our Africanity. My question becomes, well, how do we distinguish like the Commodore class among like Africans in the United States from like the Africanity of like partisan, like working class Black people, or like people who have a more, for lack of a better term, more like progressive, radical vision about what it is to be African? Because like they do have an ideal about what is, a Black way of life.
Right. You have to have a class analysis. There's no way around it. You have to deal with class. You have to engage with class. I won't say the only difference. I would say that one difference is just that African-centered perspective includes class. It's understand that class is important. It just doesn't center it per se. it's not it's not centered as in the socialist perspective. But we definitely understand that class is a part of it, and you have to engage with it. There's just no way around it. You have to have a class analysis.
There's some anarchist critique around class analysis. You ever read any?
Oh no. I mean, the anarchist material that you introduced is pretty much my first actual anarchist material that I've actually started reading into.
Okay. Well, we'll think about that for next year. Hey man, I'm all for having open discussions. This is great.
Yeah, but yeah, I would just say that class can't be ignored. You have to have a class analysis. You have to engage in class. We just don't center class as the central, but we understand that it's important.
On that
socialists
note,
would say, yeah.
Oh, go ahead. My bad. Go ahead and finish.
Yeah, the socialists would say that you have to center class. You can't denigrate it in any way because that's a mistake. They would say it would have to be the centering of it, the foundation of it. And they would just be, that's just a main difference.
I was going to say on top of that, though, I read something from Du Bois, and I tend to agree that I believe he said that the class consciousness never really surpassed the race consciousness here, and so for me, I would say our identities would have to include that, like you said, it would have to include the class consciousness, but I don't think the class consciousness can override anything.
Mm.
I totally agree. This is the land of absolute white supremacy. It seemed like, over 74 million people voted for Donald Trump. Not to say that the Republicans are any better than the Democrats, so forth and so forth. But I feel like this just goes to highlight, if 74 million people voted for Donald Trump, let's say a large percentage of them were working class white. So like working white people voted for a billionaire. So,
Yeah.
It goes to show you can work against your own interests that are like class-based, but based on like a racial allegiance. And I think this goes back to the last text you read by James Sakai, the settler colonialism.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. That's a weird thing, in the United States. That usually race trumps, like class. What do you feel like in terms like a future a way of life, beyond like this capitalism? What do you feel like would be like the more ideal situation? Like how would we deal with that tension of that of like dealing with white supremacy, but also like the capitalism itself, and like in a mix of trying to like experiment and create a new way of African life, if you will?
Yeah, I think that's why we got to have nationhood. Like we got to be sovereign.
Power.
Yeah.
Can you have sovereignty? I feel like I want to argue my friend's argument right now because he's gonna scream if I don't. So, can you have sovereignty really in America? Can you build the African cultural? Can you have African culture in America, or do we have to, beyond a shadow of a doubt, leave America and go to Africa?
Who says that African culture still intact in Africa versus here?
I would say that he's correct about the perspective, because Africa is also has been colonized and dominated as well. But I would say I don't think it's practical. History is history, so I don't think it's practical that African people are going to be able to relocate from one geographical area to another. I think wherever there's a majority of African people, we need to fight for self-determination, for sovereignty, because I don't see any practical future where most of us are back on the motherland. So can we have sovereignty where we at in the Americas, where there's a majority of us? I say yes, but it's going to take revolution, and I don't see how it's going to happen without some type of bloodshed.
I feel that. Okay.
But we have to believe it's possible, because I don't know, if we don't believe it's possible, I just don't know what we're going to do, because I know we're not all going to go back to the motherland.
I think you can bring it down to this right old regular Babylon, where, in terms of like gentrification, people are displaced, but most people don't, leave and go out to the country who are, like Black and working class. I feel like it goes to show that most people just stay where they are. So I kind of agree with Dor that wherever Black people are, and we're in numbers, we must have power. But
Okay, I dig that. I'll show my friend this video.
But I do, Jador?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you were going to say something, but I don't, at least like a terminology I was like thinking about a few years ago was like kind of like a post-American future, that like new Africans or like Black people in the United States, African peoples, we must conceive and think about a post-American future, because like whether we believe it or not, the United States is on a decline.
Right. Yeah.
Like culturally, economically, and politically. So whether we believe, or I heard, I don't really like quoting him so much, because it's like culturally, it's not like woke or whatever. But I remember Khalid Muhammad used to always say that you may not believe that you at war, but you definitely in war. And that's how I kind of think about people who believe the United States is all there is, all there ever will be, and so forth. So I feel like it's kind of the duty and responsibility of people who believe otherwise. I do believe it's a belief, a type of metaphysics, if you will, to conceive of a different paradigm and a different reality. That's the responsibility of us, to conceive and think in the process of America's decline. And hopefully we can help it decline faster.
Absolutely. And I do think the day that we get African sovereignty in America is not going to be in existence. I think the moment that happens, there will probably be a world revolution happening or something like that. So the day that the day that New Africa is actually sovereign, I think that day America will no longer exist. It's going to be a result of some type of world revolutionary war or something, and America's no longer going to exist. It's going to be New Africa and independent indigenous nations everywhere. What we know is America is not going to exist at that point.
I'm curious, what you guys see in the difficulty in trying to like realize this in real time? Because I just come to accept like this is like a lifetime and kind of like adventure, a process that we may or may not live to see some actualities of like what our dreams are about, what the type of world we want to be in. But what are the difficulties you see in trying to like actualize these like kind of like new methodologies about conceiving of a new future, but also being pragmatic enough to realize that we got to survive in the here and now?
Let me say this. Difficulties, I'm not sure I can articulate, but what I felt at one point on a sort of spiritual level, y'all remember that moment when there was a lot of attention what was going on in Palestine, and there was like a lot of international solidarity around that, and there was some attention on what was going on in Haiti, and also there was like the red, it was like a red flag thing going on in some part of Africa somewhere. At that moment, with the attention on the struggle in Palestine, and what I was more, at this point, I was more of a leftist. I felt like revolution can happen in like 10 years. Now, I don't know how I feel about that now, but I remember when Palestine first started getting a lot of attention, and Israel started getting a lot of attention, and in recent memory, I felt like we can have revolution in our lifetime. you know, and I guess I've been trying to keep that feeling since then. I'm not sure how I feel about that now, but I remember feeling, and I think that feeling, if we can get back to that feeling, where there's a lot going on internationally, where we can make people feel like revolution could happen in a lifetime, I think that has a lot of the work, but that's more metaphysical, zygote, spiritual type of stuff. But I believe that stuff has an effect, because it had an effect on me. Like, I actually felt like we can have revolution in our lifetime when that whole thing first started going on with Palestine there.
I feel that, man. I've letting go of the idea of revolution. I hate to say that on here, but I've let go of the idea of a giant people struggle towards something different. The whites did it January 6th. They ran up on the Capitol. But that's not the revolution we wanted. But you got competing interests. You got people who decide to want to be a part of the system. And I think it's very, I don't, you know, in my book, I wrote a chapter, I call it Insurrection Pending Revolution, like playing off of Huey's words, because it goes back to what we were talking about. Is I feel like building the communities, right? Which is why I pulled this up, because this is like the basis of economic theory I was like trying to go with, because it's that I feel like we should be spending our intergenerational mission on building economies, local economies that are distributive like this, in such a way, so that way we can kind of dedicate ourselves to this thing, and maybe we could live in it while we're fighting for it. You know what I mean? We might be able to pull it up. We might be able to, you know, get 25% there in 30 years, or even 60 years, you know, or maybe even 5% in 30 or 40 years. But at least we're moving towards a goal, I feel like, because I'm gonna go ahead and say it, and I hate to say this, but I'm gonna have to keep it real. They felt revolution was gonna happen in the 70s. You know what I mean? And Reagan got elected after that. And that was the height of our revolutionary struggle. That was the height. You talking about a whole Black Liberation Army form. You know what I mean? So, you know, if struggle produces consciousness, well, what the hell happened? It was the height of consciousness. How the hell did Reagan get in there? And how are we at the point now where people, you know, Obama, and that was cool? I mean, I don't know. I mean, to me, I haven't bought into, and this is kind of why I pivoted towards anarchism, right? Because I didn't feel like some of the Marx and Leninist lingo is living up to its hype. And I just kind of feel like it's kind of like I'm being told something that's starting to remind me a little bit of religion. Wait for the great revolution, like wait for the rapture, instead of going out there and building these things up that we need. And to me, if capitalism has these internal contradictions, you know, like this book says, you know, they've 17 contradictions of capitalism, which I thought was great, and it's going to collapse, then we should be forming alternative societies that can bring our people in and say, you don't have to go back there, and let it crumble on its own. If we can build alternatives and say, like, this is how we're living, you know what I mean? Start trying to build up that alternative mode of production, you know? And that's like utopian socialism, you know? Or we could continue to try to form armies and go after this thing and fail miserably, like the Panthers did and the Black Liberation Army did. And we got to say some of these things, and that hurts, but it's the truth. You know what I mean? We can't just say, well, it's COINTELPRO, that's why we failed. Yeah. So we got to calculate that into our struggles, you know, not just, you know, think about it. And I'm not trying to discourage anybody, because I'm not saying revolution may never happen. I'm just saying insurrection, meaning build our own economy pending the great revolution that may or may not come, as it was supposed to come in the 70s, as other people predicted it was going to come in the 80s, and predicted it was going to come in the 90s, and predicted it was going to come, you know? So that's my thoughts.
Yeah. And just to add on to what you said about, you guys talking about like the feeling I kind of felt some of that with the uprising, like in 2020 with the George Floyd situation. That for me, I don't know. It was just, I remember, being in Chicago and vividly just like, walking into the balcony and visibly seeing what was happening and it's saying, what a time to be alive. The feeling of like anything was possible. Nobody's working, and this is a global situation. So I do believe like there can be like global interconnected struggles, but like a big R revolution, I'm not quite sure. I heard Ashanti Holston, he gave a talk in like I think it was like 2005 in Oakland. And he was discussing his experience in the Black Liberation Army and when he went to prison and the readings he was introduced to, and like his changing of his perspective and like the despair he felt after the failures of like the 60s and 70s in terms of like the theories they believed in and the rigidness of it all. And he said what kind of inspired him was kind of speak to brother Zahir, is kind of like alternative, communities, so forth and so forth, was the Zapatista uprising in 94, 95. And that was kind of like, for me, I feel like kind of like the beginning of the popularization, at least subculturally at that point, of anarchism as like a politic for Black people, was that beginning of like the Zapatista uprising and the small worlds, if you will, that they was creating from being in a state of insurrection against the state, but they was living their revolution, if you will.
That's where I'm at. Let's live it. I don't, like we could talk about how great it would be after we take power, but why not just try to create it? You know what I mean? I mean, we could talk all day about that in like the future, but what could we do in the here and the now?
Yeah, and there's two last things. It makes me think of people, you said pie in the sky and sweet by and by after we die type of situation. And Ben Moray, he was a member of the Up Against the Wall motherfuckers. I don't know you guys familiar with them. They was kind of like in alliance with the Black Panther Party doing like the riots in New York in like 68. And they later like left, he was part of the whole like insurrectionary wave coming out of New York City. But he has a saying that we must believe and fight as if the revolution will happen tomorrow, but know that it won't and be okay with it.
Mm.
Yeah, I feel
so.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm with you. I think we should be focused on building communities, building institutions. I think that's where most of our revolutionary spirit needs to go. Of course, people are going to have their own visions of how to do that, but I think if people care about Black people, they love Black people, I think we can even build coalitions around that, coalitions around institution building and community building, and let that be our primary struggle.
I think Ashanti Austin was on a new episode of Black Power Media, wasn't he?
Yep. Well, Soldier Stories.
Oh, okay. Okay. Soldier Story, there it is.
But even till I heard, read somewhere where Shah Shakur critique of the Black Liberation Army was, in her perspective, like, how can you have people? You can't have a people's army without the people. And she felt that the Black Liberation. You go ahead.
I mean that's when I watched that movie, the newer one with Fred Hampton, right? When I watched that movie, there was a scene where they were in the their headquarters, if I remember correctly, and they started shooting against the police. But then when I looked at the scene, it was like there was a crowd on the other side, like entertained, like, oh, look at that. But they weren't like, yo, it's revolutionary time. They were just like, man, look at them crazy motherfuckers over there.
Yeah.
That was a mistake. And Karenga also said that too, when he kind of critiqued, Huey and them dudes, like, how you gonna have that revolution and too far in front of the people? You can't say those things. And then, and that's what I'm really getting at. And maybe I should ask this question here. part of my struggle is I believe the reason why I called my philosophy ethno-political is because I feel like we should come together as groups of people, as conscious people, and try to realize these things with ourselves and bring whoever we can evolve it from the masses. I don't think we can be too dependent on the masses to solve all of our problems. Which is why I kind of, when I say ethno-political, New African, like form these communities, and if they come along because we're building this stuff up, that's great. Now, I'm not saying completely get rid of them, but I am kind of pushing towards us. I guess in a way, almost like the NOI, it's something that you might want to join, something that you might want to become a part of. But I'm not finna chase after you and all your little contradictions and fortune. I'm not knocking on your door. I'm not a Jehovah's Witness. I may say, hey, support local economy because we all live in a local economy. But what I'm not going to do is just like, you need to study this dialectical historical.
About, I don't know if you've seen that conversation, but there was a conversation on the African Center channel. I don't know if you watched it, between nationalist people, and they had let's just say a spirited conversation between the difference between trying to be like Christians and converting people as opposed to recruiting people. And one was basically arguing for like and what's that word?
Evangelicalism.
Yeah, one was pretty much arguing for doing that type of thing, being an evangelical for nationalism. And the other one was arguing, no, like, that's not African. There's nothing African about. African religions don't proselytize. So yes, we should recruit people, but we shouldn't be trying to proselytize. And they had a very spirited discussion about that. So you pretty much just stated what your position would be, unless you want to elaborate further or, But there was you should watch it. It's brothers. You met these brothers, it was on
Omawale in it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I know them. Yeah,
it was on my speech channel.
Okay. Yeah.
Discussion about that.
Yeah, I'd say ethno-political. And ethno-political, I define similar, just think New African. But basically, let me pull this up real quick because this is all the stuff I study anyway.
But I thought that was interesting that you brought that up because I was thinking about that as well. Like, should we be trying to convert people or recruit, or what's the difference between recruiting and converting?
Here's the thing, right? Like ethno-religious, a grouping of people are unified around a common religious and ethno background. I just took the religious out and put political. So a grouping of people who are unified with a common ethnic and political ideology. So ethnic is dealing with these cultural practices, traditions, marriage rights, holidays. That's why I wrote the African holiday list. Like it's something that could meet those needs that like those 6 African virtues I wrote. Those are things to teach children, right? So it's like if they have a rites of passage, we're teaching them the Maguzi African identity. Here's the 6 African virtues: reverence, self-control, mindfulness, courage, dedication, and working communalism, right? And that's how we like live and carry on our lives. I envision like building a temple that operates just like a church. We do our mutual aid. We also do our political work towards the communalist economy that I showed and things like that. And then people do come into that identity, just like people would kind of convert into Judaism. But, there's things called cultural Judaism where it's not necessarily religious, right? But you are coming into that identity. Just like in African spirituality, in some ways, if you do initiate in there, you do take on that identity. Like I initiate into Awe Voodoo. So I have to study Awe people. I have to know their story. If you initiate into the Yoruba, you're supposed to know their people and know that story. So in that same way, if you kind of come into the ethno-political identity of the Maguzi, you study the ideology and the stories, and you become that as we go on. And everybody doesn't have to join. Some people may just like the local economy point. But that's me, how I stand on it, because a lot of people talk this stuff, but the NOI did work. Right. That's and Garveyism had a lot of spiritualism in there. Rastafarianism, those are things that do spirituality talks to people, but to me, it doesn't need to be dominant, but it does talk to people.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. Personally, myself, I do think I'm more interested in the focus on building institutions, developing propaganda models, building organizations to deal with material conditions as a way of recruiting. I think I'm more interested in that as opposed to proselytizing or being evangelical and trying to convert people. Like I'm part of a religious institution. I think that's, I don't think my spirit is there, but I also think that's probably why I'm not necessarily big on protests. Though I understand why protests are used. It's just not necessarily something that my spirit moves me towards.
Well, to me, it's reform. Yeah. I mean, it's just, how long are you going to beg for something? I mean, we're saying we demand, I'm reading Max Stirner, this egoist, and he's saying freedom can't be granted. It can only be taken. Right. So if something is given to you, whether it's some kind of reform that you asked for, and you didn't take that freedom, they gave it to you. You know what I mean? So to me, it's like constant. Go ahead. But we got 5 minute warning. And I think it's cut off. If it doesn't cut off, we can keep going. But go ahead.
I don't know. Maybe this is like the semantics, but I distinguish just like from my own personal experience between like riot-like conditions, insurrection from like a protest. I feel like those things like two drastically different things. Like, the movements of like people doing like the uprising, I won't consider those to be like protesting because they wasn't like asking particularly for anything. It was just like smash and grab versus.
I agree with that. Yeah.
So I don't know. I do always like to distinguish that because I feel like Jador, I feel like I'm not going to protest. It's a waste. I don't feel like it's a waste. I feel like it was necessary for me in like my early stages of like political development to be introduced to something like that. But as I further got along, I just like, that ain't what I'm interested in because I've seen other and like I feel like a insurrectionary type of ride is way more liberating and feeling wise about like your own capacity and like political possibilities than like holding up signs and things of that nature.
It's an accepted form of struggle. I mean, I don't know how people call themselves revolutionary and go protest. What the hell are you doing?
I feel the same thing about like when people say about like abolishing police. I remember vividly. I say, who do we expect to do it?
Yeah. You keep asking like, what the hell are you talking about? I thought all of this was just reform work.
Yeah, I mean, I feel you. I've been trying to think about ways to like, say it without, without sounding like I guess being negative, but it brings me also to the question because you can extend it and talk about voting, but people would say, well, you gotta, just the way they say you gotta meet people in a church because that's where people are at. They say, well, you gotta be where people are at, and people are mostly voting as opposed to doing alternatives to voting.
In my opinion, it's like that because we don't have a mission, we don't have a plan, and we don't have a strategy. So when you call yourself socialist and you join socialist organization, nobody knows what the hell's going on. They just come together and like, what are we going to do? Oh, we're just going to fight for the sake of fighting. Let's go protest this. Let's go protest that. I mean, if there's a protest for every letter in the alphabet, they'll do it because they don't know what else they're going to do. How else do we seize the means of production? What do we do? How do we got to do this? Nobody knows. And nobody knows partially because they all got killed off from COINTELPRO, all the OGs. That's what I've seen in all these organizations that I've been into. It's a clear loss of a particular strategy and mission. That's what I've seen, in my opinion. Is just sort of like, yeah, so let's protest because it's a social justice thing, and that's a social justice bug or spirit that just moves everything. So it's not a real strategy towards what we're talking about, institutional building, and it's really more so just to me, it's no different than just Democrats or something. Not even Democrats, but just civil rights. People nowadays who call themselves revolutionary strike me as nothing more than civil rights struggles, or militant integrationists, to be honest with you.
Hmm.
You know, that's a term we know in African center circles. Military integrations.
A term I feel like I've been saying this for years. I feel like I probably is I distinguish. I'm not, I'm fine with like abolition and all that, but I like the terminology of being a demolitionist because I feel like that's like what's like the heart of it all. You have to destroy like the policing apparatus attached to the state in order to desire of like an alternative to like public safety, if you will. But I feel like it's better to say demolition or abolition because it seems that the whole abolition thing is kind of like birthed its own like subcultural social justice enterprise. Like people write books about it. Politicians can make like lip service to like alternative forms of like public safety. But I don't feel like you can co-opt demolition.
Yeah, that's what it's about. That's what it's about. Books, and you got it right. Money. You know how many grants you can get by saying abolition?
Yeah, that reminds me of the term confrontational as well. I heard that for a while. We need to be more confrontational. And to a degree, I agree, but I think we need to be more confrontational with ourselves. I think we need to be more critical of ourselves. I understand we have external forces we got to deal with, but I think we need to be more honest and just straightforward with ourselves about who we are, what we're doing wrong, what we're not doing enough of.
I guess the old folks would say a coming to Jesus meeting.
It ain't gonna happen. I'm gonna tell y'all right now, I've been doing that for years. It ain't gonna happen. Well, I'm sorry. I try not to be so pessimistic. My bad.
Yeah, and then
I think we have to form alternatives, is what I'm trying to say. Ethno-political. If to me, I'm just at a point where I'm like, everybody has their truths and their circles. I'm just gonna go ahead and come out with this. I don't know who's gonna watch this video, but at the end of the day, just stop with Marx and Leninism. Number one, just stop. Damn it, and throw that shit out of the window. Okay, let's get for real. Okay, Huey was in the 70s. It's okay to move on. That's another big problem. Is stop immortalizing these people from the 70s that are fucking dead. We got our theories are stuck in the past. I mean, I feel like I might as well start a Black Reconstruction Party. That's what this shit sounds like to me. Oh, they only stopped Reconstruction because it was the Klan. We need to restart this revolutionary style. What the fuck are you talking about? It's outdated. It is time to move on. Damn. But the problem is people cannot think. You guys are too dependent, like I was, on rationality. And you think these folks are going to be rational if you point out evidence to them. And I'm telling y'all, people are saying don't think evangelical and don't think religious. Marxists are religious. Try to go out there and tell them there's some problems with dialectical materialism and watch religion come up. Go up to these folks that believe and say, I don't think what you're saying is true. Let's reconsider something. Let's look at some different strategies. Oh, no. That's not what Huey said. That's not what Bobby said. Yeah. Straight up. Because it's a pre-automated response, and it's even on the Black side. Ain't no economic theory over there. And so, but they say Marx and all of that shit just straight crackerism, but they have no concepts of econ. So they keep pointing us towards shit that doesn't exist. Like we just gotta study things that aren't there. So when we go up to them and say, here's some real economy, here's some real shit, study, niggas. I mean, my bad. Study. It's like, oh, no, we can't. If it doesn't fit my already accepted reality, we're gonna say no. So we got to come up with something completely new. Okay,
question.
Now I'm not.
Do you feel like kind of in working class Black communities, do you feel like these kind of attempts at alternatives you brought up, like NUI, Marcus Garvey movement, what I consider to be like the Ankh-Reich, the Hebrew Israelites, are attempts at kind of breaking away from the dominant paradigm, even though I may necessarily, fall in line or agree with it, but I do kind of recognize that these kind of Promethean type organizations and groups of people who are trying to attempt that some type of alternative?
You know, I hanged out with a group of Hebrew Israelites when I first got out of the army, and they were really nice, right? To me anyway. And they had a house, and I was staying with them in their house, and I went out there and I preached with them. And one thing I liked about them was when this white man walked by, and one of the dudes said, "And we're gonna slave your cracker kids," and he took off running. Hey. And I was like, ah. And I kind of felt good for a second, because I was like, "How you know how it feels? You know, you got to turn away and walk away, and what you gonna do about it?" But with that being said, I think that they're kind of just religious. That religion doesn't offer no real alternative, you know. There is the reason why I'm bringing it up, because there was a lot of angst that people did want an alternative, but it's co-opted by religion. You know what I mean? It's co-opted by this falsehoods of like, oh, this is like Jesus type thing, and it's not something that brings a tangible alternative. It doesn't get you to think about the world. It just tells you fantasies, but it's kind of co-opting a need for something different. So yes, I kind of agree. I think I am agreeing with what you're saying to a certain extent. It's just co-opting the need for freedom.
How does that not lead to like occultism, or like there's something that purely remains a subculture?
You said what? How does that not? What are you talking about?
I'm talking like no, I'm talking about like, let's say like more along the lines of what you were discussing, like, you know, like a way of life, a holistic way of life, principles to works. How does that lead to being like what Drew was called like encapsulated?
Well, to me, the thing is that you know, they say that, right? But there's plenty of personality cults that came out of materialism and panther behavior. So I'll just throw that out there. But with that being said, for me, when I explain my thing, when I say ethno-cultural, right, you are identify as yourself. You know, I am the Maguzi, right? The Maguzi is self-transformative struggle, right? Self-actualizing, self-correcting, self-creative, self-transformative, and self-liberating, right? So those are the things that you do for your own self, you know. And so the reason why I thought that was important is because being an individual, when you go through your own transformative struggle, you can decide how you contribute. You don't have to be a part of this group, right? Me as a Maguzi, just like a Jewish person may identify as a Jew, doesn't necessarily need to be a part of a synagogue, right? Because they are Jewish. So if I am the Maguzi, I understand local economy is what we're going for. I, as an individual, could get a degree in poli-sci to form policies that will help this out. You know what I mean? Others may decide to form groups to say, this is how we're doing, right? Collectively, this is how we may take action, you know. But at the end of the day, it's a diverse understanding is the point that I'm trying to get at. That's why I think it will stop towards that kind of silo, because it is saying that we are a part of the community. We are saying we're trying to form a community, and we are going against capitalism. We're not just so much trying to go into the woods, right? Like other communalists. Like, that's my problem with others. I have friends that are utopian socialists, but I'm like, you're gonna go off in the community and howl at the moon. You know what I mean? But that's nothing. What we got to do is there has to be this dialectic between building our own and still going that. But the way of life is something that anybody can identify with and go through their own transformation. And so that, to me, stops it right there, because it's individual and collective. And I don't hate the Panthers, by the way. I just
we care on that. Yeah.
A healthy amount of, like you said, it goes back. I feel like Jador, I think he brought it up to the point of we have to critique ours. It's okay to be in conversation with them. Like, I used to, when I was younger, my teenage years, I used to absolutely like idol worship. Till I realized all humans are the same. And I feel like in the Black community, we have a tendency towards like this idolization, or what you like you were speaking about, towards like Huey Newton and others, towards like, idol worship and like, particular personalities versus, taking them as like stories and examples of what we could be as well.
Yeah. I mean, I'm at a point where we have to do something different. Like, I'm really, and I know I'm self-promoting, but I really am trying to create something brand new, because I feel like my generation older is just done. And we're just done because we lack critical thinking. Not you guys, because obviously you guys critically think, but I just think like I'm just so done with it. If I get an automated response to a question, well, history is a protracted struggle. Like, okay, you read that somewhere and you're repeating it. You know what I mean? Like, come up with a Bible quote. You know what I mean? Why don't you? You know what I'm saying? I'm trying to seriously answer problems in the movements. How do we go to work and still be a part of the movements? How do we justify that?
But
How
also
do we justify?
go
ahead. My bad. Go ahead.
With your focus on a cultural thing, one thing I think we need to confront is that we're dealing with a certain amount of Afrophobia, I think. And I mean, not in the sense of the masses. I mean, I'm talking about us that read, that are part of organizations. I think there is a Afrophobia that exists, which keeps us from studying ourselves as much as maybe we should. Not saying that you have to take an African-centered perspective, but I believe that Black people in general should know more about our history and culture and philosophy more than any other people. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think that Black people in general know more about ourselves than other people. And I think that may be because of some type of phobia or anti-Africanism within ourselves.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. But I think it's also the narrative, to be honest with you. I think there's an I'm an oppressed narrative that dominates. And then, so therefore, hands up, don't shoot. And so, I just feel like we have to study ourselves also as active agents in our own history, like Malafi Asante said, and don't just study ourselves as, passive. And that's one of the reasons why I like this reading particularly, because it did show what we were doing, right? Yes, we did. There was Europeans that did come. So we're acknowledging that, but also showing our active lifestyle. And we're also showing that there's positives and negatives that were there, right? It wasn't the noble savages that had no wrongdoing or had no concept, right, of anything. You know what I mean? So like they had something.
Punished.
What's up?
Yeah, people did get punished for transgressions.
People got punished, right? And it wasn't restorative justice, even though I'm a fan of restorative justice, right? And so like it was a punishment. And also like he said, women were oppressed in some places, maybe, and I don't think it was all places, but they were certainly oppressed in some places, which means they recognized differences in sex, right? It wasn't this pre-colonial, everybody's the same, no distinctions, we're all just happy together all the time. So, we have to view ourselves as active agents in our own struggle. I think one of the readings we had, a Collective Courage, one of the people here was just like, I didn't even know Black people did this kind of stuff, right? I didn't even know Black folks fought back. I didn't know Black folks formed cooperatives, right? Because I think that a lot of the narrative is just that we're victims, continue to be victims, and that shapes how we go fight. We fight for the victims, for the oppressed, for the, what I'm saying here is that the entire socialist left is like that, victims, because they can't think towards building institutions because everything is coming from this oppressed narrative first. So therefore, all of our actions have to go for protecting this helpless groups, in my opinion. You see what I'm saying? Instead of saying we're the ones that are taking action, we're building this because we want an alternative, because God damn it, that's who the fuck we are. You know what I'm saying? I'm trying not to cuss so much, but and that's just that's where I'm at with all this, you know. And I promise y'all, I don't hate socialists. I just got a lot of built up critiques, man. So
I feel similar. Do you feel like intersectionality, at least like the versions we have of it, have kind of like led to some of this kind of like the safe space and
I've been silenced on some issues.
Yeah, or like if you're I don't know, I'm just be 100. If you like unapologetically masculine in a space that leans more towards a intersectional perspective that gears towards more like queer people, which is fine. I feel like, do you feel like kind of like the BLM intersectionality narrative kind of alienated a place for Black men in the movement?
I feel like the problem is that we keep looking at ourselves as passive victims, right? And so when we do that and we don't study Africa, like Jadorian was talking about, or we only study Africa from this lens of being victims, my African centeredness says, what is African? Like, what is that? You know, so if it's, let me say it in a way where I won't get in trouble here. I watched this movie with Native Americans, right? I think it was Dances with Wolves. And long story short, they got into it with the white folks, right? After the white folks came and it was destroying things, the white folks were changing the way that they were making collective decisions, right? And so it was these white folks and Native Americans, and they were talking. And the white folks said, well, we want y'all to take a vote about bringing liquor into you guys' community. And the elder stood up and he said, as an elder, that is wrong. And I say I condemn it. But then the new generation was like, I don't care about what you're saying. You know, we're this new moderate thing with these Europeans. And they say democracy is everybody has a voice. It's that individual democracy. And you guys, you elders, don't have that same power. So then they voted to bring liquor in. You see what I'm saying? And my point there is just that if we study who we are, our concept of democracy means consensus, our version of this. And we may say we don't want liquor, or we may say we don't agree with some things that America may find progressive, whether it's voting, whether it's the concepts of gender and what's gender and what's not. Who are we? And let that be who we are, despite what the dominant society is. And I think that it's a joke sometimes because the term African, everybody projects their ideology on the pre-colonial Africa instead of looking at African philosophy and then working backwards from there. Everybody projects that onto the continent. You see what I'm saying? And so we don't really come together and define ourselves as a culture and define who we are. This is our belief systems. This is what we're rooted in. And so then our existence really does become an act of defiance. But the problem is when we do that, we may find that some of the pre-colonial Africa may have things that the Europeans don't agree with. But what do we do when we grew up here in America and we actually accept unknowingly some of the things that liberal democracy tells us? Are we truly African? Are we truly being revolutionary in that cultural sense? Or are we just being dark-skinned whites? That's where I'm at. Because some things aren't going to be liked by other people when you're doing your own damn thing. But you got to have the courage, which is one of the 6 African virtues, to stand out and do that shit anyway. And just be who you are, you know? And that kind of is my critique against a little bit towards the Black nationalists a little bit, because we have to run our own economies. And I think the best way to do that is through local economies, right? Not because that's what they have. They got Wall Streets. We may not want a Wall Street. We may need something that we could have autonomy, because that's important to who we are as African people, is autonomy. You see what I'm saying? And then that autonomy then dictates our actions. So we don't even want your $1 billion. So it's not a class analysis necessarily to say fuck Kanye and all of them. It's just that our group, our culture, our consensus dictates that what we need is communalism for autonomy. You see the difference? That's where I'm at. That's where I think about it. So to answer your question, I just think that it causes problem because nobody has a damn center, or their center is really white, but they just trying to act like it's not.
Yeah, that's interesting. That may be it. But I think a lot of the issue comes in because they see African, or what we may call being African or Africa, as something that's not dynamic, something that's not inherently evolutionary, which is to say, when I think about Africa, I don't think about it in an idealistic sense. I understand that Africa has its own internal forces to deal with and also external forces, and those always existed. So it's dynamic. But I do think a lot of our people think about African culture as something that's static. That's in the past, not something that's dynamic, that's always been involving dealing with its own internal and external pressures.
Yeah.
But even with that said, even though I understand that African culture is dynamic and it's not static, still, as African people in a contemporary sense, we're trying to center ourselves and learn about Africa and use it to deal with contemporary issues as we look towards sovereignty. So that within itself is going to require us not to be static. Though I just disagree with this sort of general viewpoint that Africa is a static culture, that it's not dynamic.
Yeah. Definitely, man. I definitely agree with that. I think that's part of the issue is kind of, there's no, how do you bring these things into reality, right? Like, how do we, after we study it in its purest form from thousands of years ago, you get the purest of Black, ancient pyramids, go all the way back. How do we implement it today? Like, what does this look like, right? Yeah. And part of the research, we should read this, Blueprints for Black Power, right? Because he talks about all of this. He talks about ethnicity as a point of power, and solidarity through ethnic identity. So that's where I really got it from, was Bob Amos Wilson. So
dope.
Well, I just leave it like this. The word that comes to the mind when John Doe was spoken was being self-defined. For me, to be an African, to be active in our historical time is to be self-defined, and but as I hear you was talking about being self-transformation. So for me, we can't just go based on what our ancestors said what was being African. We ourselves, for our time, have to define for us what it means to be an African.
That's what I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
But it's pushing 9 o'clock. I gotta.
You started it. This is all your fault, Seika.
Hey man, blame it on the Black man. I'm used to it. It takes 30 minutes for Negroes to leave anyway, or start anything.
Yep. That's all it is. That's all it is, man. So
we carry on an African tradition, African people time.
I don't know who gonna sit here and watch this whole video. It's been recording the whole thing, so y'all gonna get me in trouble and everything. So, but all right. Huh?
So if they don't watch the whole, if it's long, they might even skip over some parts. You might get lucky.
I might get lucky. All right. Well, till next time, man. I think I'm gonna pull out. I'm gonna find something good. I may do something on Kwanzaa, but till next time, you guys. This was a good read, good sit, good talk.
Yeah, definitely, man. Peace.
Oh, one more. I'm gonna put this up. That's my book right there.
Becoming African: Radical Transformation, Art of, how you pronounce it?
Maguzi.
That looks dope.
So I'm gonna go ahead and just promote that since you guys brought it up. My computer going slow, but all right. Peace.
Peace.